Welcome back to the Liberty Insider. Before the break, at least me as a semi-oldie, my wife won't allow me to call myself an oldie, and a mature gentleman, we were talking about the young people and their dalliance with pseudo-knowledge on the internet and so on.
Yes.
But it does come to a bigger question that internet or not, just through the media and where we get our information, where we get our news, and it's sort of a truism of late that large urban societies particularly are not going to libraries, aren't studying for themselves, and they're sort of fed these spoonfuls of information that may even be misinformation. And it's hard for them to know reality. And then you put in religion, which is a complex topic anyway, and it can create huge misperceptions, I think, the way it's presented.
Absolutely. And I'm a very strong believer that a lot of times the media will characterize various individuals, people groups, whether it's minorities, whether it's the rich versus the poor, the Hispanic community, and ultimately I believe that the way that we should perceive all of humanity is through the eyes of Scripture, and that is we have a world that is in need of a Savior, and we have the plague of sin that every member of humanity is suffering from. So we need to really understand that and not demonize people, but really seek to save the lost.
Well, we need to have a viewpoint or a filter, but quite the same, that we apply to all information. But there's probably a thin line between that and a presupposition that only accepts information consistent with that and rejects troubling things. So the trick is to have people that are open-minded and yet not easily led astray.
That's a very good point. I'm glad you mentioned that. That's so important.
I really think that rather than a lot of information individually available, our society, our culture, and our world is more full of information than ever before. I mean, all of the ages before don't cumulatively add up to what is known right now. But that doesn't mean you and I know it all.
Absolutely.
Even if we knew it, do we comprehend it? So in some ways, I think the individual is adrift in a sea of competing information, confusing information, disinformation. And I know you have a burden on it, and sometimes people even tweak me with it, the conspiracy theory stuff. But I think the protection against that is to for us as Christians, reference that against our biblical worldview. And to me, it's uncanny how much of what's happening in the US and the larger world in recent years tracks perfectly with some of the last verses of Revelation. It talks about an end time. I remember in 2008, I wrote an article on the economic collapse that we're still living through. We really haven't rebuilt from that. And of course, in Revelation, it says the merchants will cry and wonder at their wealth lost in 1 hour. That's the modern world, and of course that's not the full fulfillment. But when you see that stuff, you know that plans to rebuild the economy and to deal with the national debt, those need to be addressed, and secular people need to do the best they can. But you and I know that's not going to end well.
No.
It's going to end with the collapse of the world as we know it and the establishment of an eternal kingdom. So we've got a template to put over these things.
That's right.
But we also can't allow ourselves to be characterized by the secularists as just people that don't care about what's happening here, or worse, that we're irrelevant ourselves to what's happening here, because we can be discarded. And the Pope, in his recent speech, and a number of people that have picked up from this sort of stuff on the war on terror, they constantly decrying fundamentalists and extremists. Are you willing to be called a fundamentalist?
No.
You're not? Well, on one level I'm not, but yet
Yes.
I have to be a fundamentalist. It's fundamental to me what God's holy word says. I order my life by it. So just as with gay, it used to be a word about happy people and that. It's been subverted and used to something different. And I think I think somewhere they've thought it through, and it's being used consciously to marginalise people of faith that differ from, if not a secular, then a narrow religious viewpoint, to demonise them. Oh, fundamentalists, extremists.
Yes, and I didn't get your question.
Now, vegetarianism is, many people think that's an extremist viewpoint.
Yeah.
Well, I don't necessarily think so.
Well, if my faith causes people to call me a fundamentalist, then I'd be happy to be called a fundamentalist. The way I took your question was more in the sense of, the connotation of fundamentalist as it's used in secular society.
I set you up for it.
Is one that it doesn't use their brain, and they're very closed-minded and that kind of thing. And I believe that we need to be informed as Bible-believing Christians. We need to be informed. We need to know what's going on and taking place in the world, even outside of the prophetic context. Just because if we're seeking to reach the world, we need to know what their fears are, what they're thinking about, and I believe that can also be an entering wedge into a discussion where we can reach hearts and minds.
I can give you a strange example of someone that was clearly a fundamentalist and a thinking person, and some may even raise eyebrows on it because it's not the example you'd expect. But Thomas More, who was a patron saint of the Catholic Church, who was a defender of the Pope in the King's Great Issue of Henry VIII. So, in the larger debate, I might have taken the other side. Yeah. But as a human being true to his principles, there's a lot to recommend Thomas More. He was a fundamentalist, but he thought it through. He gave an admirable defense of his faith. He was not unnatural in his affections and his interrelationships. He wasn't sent. He didn't lose his head. He wouldn't go to the gallows. I think his head was cut off, but he didn't go there because he made himself obnoxious to other people. But at the end, principle was so important that rationally and in a very calculated, principled way, he took the consequence. That's really what I see as a true fundamentalist. And I think he stood for fundamental principles. Like I say, other things in the context historically, works against that. But just as a model of how that individual reacted, absolutely, I hope that I can be the same way. But we don't want to be bigoted. We don't want to be narrow-minded. We don't want to be act pejoratively toward other people. But if we believe something, we really got to stick to it. Absolutely. And I think that's the mistake of the modern world, and certainly the political world. People flip-flopping. These candidates at the moment, it's almost dizzying. It is. In some regards, I mean, what did they say yesterday? Well, today, it stands for this today. Yeah. And at the very least, all I can think of is George Orwell. Yes.
Well, in the journalistic world, they have this, and you're familiar with the term, the term spin. You can take...
I call it lying.
Yes, that would be another word for it. You see so much spin taking place today by politicians and world leaders, church leaders, that it's hard to really believe anything anymore. And so I think
what does the Bible say? Deceive, if possible, the very elect.
That's right. And it's an epidemic that we're seeing in society where lying is just so normalized that politicians are not even called out for it anymore. And if they are, it's not that big of a deal.
Well, I remember reading about one candidate. They said that they don't know that he consciously lies. It's just that when he says something that he wishes were true, he comes to believe that's true. Yes. Well, we're all capable of that, but you don't want that we're all capable of it. I'm not saying that I operate that way, but you don't want to slide into that sort of moral ambiguity.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the way that seemeth right unto a man, but leads
at the end there of his death. That's
well,
right.
I was going to put a secular interpretation, but I hesitate. It doesn't come out well in the end.
No, it doesn't.
And for politicians, sooner or later, they'll be caught out.
Yeah.
Although, when we're talking about religious liberty and consequences, the danger then is very often, and we see this happen now, it's nothing current, but I mean in our modern world, often politicians deflect, or political powers deflect culpability to someone else.
Yeah.
And I do think in this war on terror, which has strong religious elements, that anybody that holds out against it may soon find themselves being cast as an enemy of the state just because the state can't deal with the issue, and you're a problem, so just like the Emperor Nero, supposedly with the Christians in Rome.
That's
blamed
right.
them for the fire.
That's right.
Whether or not he set the fire is immaterial. He blamed them, knowing not.
You know, one of the things that I want to mention in the book Desire of Ages, which is a commentary on the life of Jesus, it's mentioned there that John the Baptist was a student of humankind, and he studied human nature. And I believe it's very important for us to do the same thing, to study what's taking place in our world, as I mentioned earlier, so that we can be better informed in reaching hearts and minds, meeting their needs where they're at, and engage in a debate that will reach humanity as a whole.
There was an old spiritual that used to go something like this: there's a man going around taking names. Now, you might think in our current context that's someone for voter registration, but I think the old song was talking about something more like Revelation, where it says the books in heaven were opened and people's lives were examined. Of course, in the great scheme of things, what we do and every action and every development of human history is registered and is knowable. Unfortunately for us, with the computer era and an explosion of, quote, knowledge, but in reality just an explosion of information/disinformation, it's becoming harder and harder for anyone to really arrive at truth. But it is imperative that each of us, in seeking truth and from a religious liberty perspective, knowing what is true religious liberty, what is a challenge to it, and how we maintain our religious liberty, we need to adhere to the facts, seek out the facts, look for knowledge, true knowledge, and apply it in a way that will guarantee our freedom and the freedom of those around us. For Liberty Insider, I am Lincoln Steed.